thanks for coming out on a not too cold February afternoon. We're glad that with all the weather in the country, Cesi Cruz was able to make the trip down from Michigan relatively easily yesterday. Just so everyone knows, this is part of our speaker series at the Center for Asian Democracy, and we're thrilled to have Cesi with us. We'll have more events upcoming in the coming months as the semester winds on. So keep your eyes on our social media feeds as well as website. The center's website will be relaunching tomorrow, and as all of my U of L colleagues know, we'll see how that goes. The website, as a means of finding out about center events, the website may become a little less useful in the short term, but we're hoping that it'll go well in the long term. But our social media accounts will still be very active for future events. So without any further ado, let me give you a brief introduction to our esteemed speaker. Cesi Cruz is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Department of Economics at the University of Michigan. She works at the intersection of political science and economics, including elections, misinformation, gender, and inclusive development. It's off script, but among the most kind of exciting and generous colleagues working in Asian politics in general, and really comparative politics in general. So we're just thrilled that she was able to make the trip down here. Her research is based primarily on fieldwork in Cambodia and the Philippines, combines social network analysis, surveys, field experiments, and any other methodological tool that she can get her hands on. Her work has been published in outlets like the American Political Science Review, American Economic Review, American Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Economic Journal, et cetera, et cetera. She's a board member of the EGAP project, the Experiments in Governance and Politics project, and Women Also Know Stuff, an organization that promotes women's scholarship in the social sciences. Social sciences? Political sciences.
Mostly political science, but we're expanding.
Yep. And Cesi also serves on the editorial board of the APSR and VoxDev. So we're really excited to have Cesi here to talk about a newer kind of dimension of her own research agenda with the title of From Correction to Connection, Relational and AI-Based Interventions for Polarization. Thanks so much, Cesi, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the warm welcome, everyone, and shout out to the snowplows in Michigan that allowed me to be here today. Yes, I'm presenting some new work that I've been working on on polarization, where I think when I first started this project, it was very much a thing where we had to explain why it was relevant and important whenever we were giving talks. And nowadays, I think people can see it in their backyards. And I think even in the U.S., political competition is feeling increasingly zero-sum and increasingly identity-based in ways that I don't think, for many of us, the political scientists, we haven't, this is sort of a new brand of polarization. The idea that it's shaping in today's politics not just what people believe, but also how they relate to each other, right? Like who we think seems familiar, who we think seems threatening, who we feel empathy for, right? Or who we feel suspicion towards, is shaped in a lot of ways by polarization. And so while it's upsetting to see it playing out in our backyards in real time, as much as it is, half a world away in countries like the Philippines, it's also not a new thing, right? Polarization has been around for a long time, and, democracies have always had conflict to some extent, right? I think what's making this unusual in terms of, this current challenge is the fact that it's also coming at a time when the nature of the political environment is also changing in these fundamental ways, right? And to me, it's like these are changes that are important for two main reasons. The first is the sort of direct communication from politicians to voters, right? And back in the day, they would need to go through an editorial board and editors and fact checkers, journalistic norms, and nowadays politicians can just tweet directly to their constituents, and there's no sort of moderating feature between what the message is and what's being received. The second is the content, right? Now that we have social media, we've got TikTok, it's really privileging this, it's definitely not tools to get at nuance and depth, right? They're more, it's a lot of sort of what goes viral and what might be very superficial. And what that means for political messaging too, though, is that it makes it moves political messaging towards things that are more emotional or something that can fit in that 20-second TikTok, right? If you give me 20 seconds for a TikTok, I can scare you, right? If you like corny jokes, I can make you laugh maybe. But even if I were a really gifted communicator, I probably can't articulate an economic development plan, right, in 20 seconds. And so the type of messaging that we're also getting has been changing alongside all of these things. And so in this talk, what I want to do is I want to talk about what are some potential solutions to all of this, right? But before I get to that, I also want to see if we can we start with reframing the problem a little bit, right? Instead of, we sometimes have a tendency, and I think political scientists are very, we're probably like the worst offenders of this, is we tend to think about polarization and misinformation as some level of information or cognition type of problem, right? If only people knew enough, if only people were more informed, if only people could deliberate and discuss, then we wouldn't have these problems. But I want to start this talk from a different premise, right? These are fundamentally relational challenges before they're informational ones. And so what they're rooted in things like identity and emotion and belonging and social connections, right? Like when you're posting something online that's political, you're not just, expressing your political view, you're articulating that you're part of this community, right? And so today I'm going to share the work from some interventions that really take that to heart, where we're trying to focus on, addressing these problems at 3 different levels, using this more relational approach. So what does this look like in practice? The whole idea is if polarization is going to be relational, then our interventions have to take that into account as well. Right, and so here I'm going to present just very quick, the heart and soul of the paper is the one in the middle, of course, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background with the others. At the elite level, this is about how politicians and elites communicate. Right? Like, what does it look like when politicians are speaking to voters? What ways do they talk that can make polarization worse or better? And second, at that community level, after that message is received, how is it interpreted in these social spaces? Like, how do communities create political meaning out of what they're hearing and what they're learning about in these other settings? And then last, once we're getting to technology and AI, I'm going to talk about some of my my current work on the systems that are increasingly moderating communication itself, right? And determining what we see, and with those kind of tools, can we design them to support reflection and thoughtful engagement in the same way that they've been used for creating content and doing all those kind of things? And so across all these different levels, the central question is the same, right? Our goal here isn't just to sort of correct or fix somehow the polarization or people's beliefs or to persuade, but what we want to do is think about ways that we can reshape interpretation, reshape these fundamental relationships between politicians and voters, and between voters and their communities, in ways that can support this sort of depolarization. And so I'm going to start at the elite level, at the level of politicians. And what I'm going to talk to you about is what polarization in the Philippines looked like in the Duterte era. Some people call the Philippines ground zero for this type, polarization and electoral misinformation in particular. And even Duterte himself supposedly at one point was complaining. He's like, Trump, everybody talks about Trump, but I was the first one who started doing this kind of thing. And I'm like, okay, But this idea that it was a highly polarized setting that he was governing in, there was this drug war that really was splitting the country apart, and a very weak opposition, and everything was sort of coming down along these sort of identity-based lines, right? Especially in the Philippines, where there's no parties are nearly as institutionalized. They're sort of loose collections of clans and families. And so this was the setting that we wanted to work in. And that 2019 senatorial election, the one that we did the study in, was widely seen as a referendum on Duterte's first term. And what we wanted to do was we were partnering with the main opposition party in the Philippines at the time. And what they wanted to know was actually a really, seems like it should be a simple question, but we don't really have a great answer to this in political science, which is, if you're a party that normally runs, if you're a normal party, you normally run on policies, can you compete with somebody who's running on scaring people and threatening people and this sort of emotional messaging and TikToks and whatnot? Can you break through in an environment like this? And so just to give you a little bit of context, I know in this audience, right, you'll be more familiar with Philippine politics than most audiences. But usually in in-person campaign activities, there is very little policy content in the Philippines at all, right? You're much more likely to see a politician doing a song and dance routine than you are seeing them articulate a policy position, right? So it's not a thing that politicians would normally do. So already we're up against the high, there's a high bar where, if we want to do policy campaigning, not only is it this very emotional setting, but it's also a setting where policy campaigning isn't very normal at all. Like, it's very unusual. The other thing that happens during in-person campaigning is these rallies, right? So this is what a rally looks like. This is then Senator Bong Revilla at one of his rallies. And what he's doing here, this is, sorry about everybody on camera, he is handing out envelopes of cash. So that's what direct, engagement with voters looks like. So not only, and taking selfies with voters, that's the other, yeah. So if you're going to be a Filipino politician, folks, these are the two skills you need to have. You need to have a good selfie game, and you need to be able to hand out envelopes of money, right? So two things about this. One is that it's very wide open. He doesn't seem bothered by the fact that people are taking pictures of him doing this. This is sort of an accepted practice, even if it is technically illegal, right? So the idea that if you think about what the normal mode of Philippine politics is exactly this sort of song and dance routine in lieu of messaging, and handouts to voters in lieu of policy promises, right? So that's sort of the background that we're working in. And so what we wanted to do was based on the Liberal Party, so this was the main opposition party at the time. They had something called Project Makinig, which means listen. And it was launched even before election year. So for Philippine political parties, this is very advanced planning. Usually, I feel like they get their campaign strategy together, around the same time we get our syllabi together for our teaching terms. And what they wanted to do was collect views and what people wanted, what type of policies would help people, and use it to come up with a campaign platform that they would then use in the 2019 elections. And so they developed a door-to-door campaign to do this. We helped with the development of this. And they let us randomize the content of their door-to-door messaging so we could test the effect of different messaging. Right? They gave out two what they call leave behinds, which one was a código or voting guide. Essentially, because there's so many different candidates, it makes it a little bit easier for somebody to know like who's on the slate that they're voting for. Because there's no straight ticket voting. So it looks like this. You don't have the código. This is the calendar. At the calendar, you just have at the top is like all of the candidates on their slate. There are 8 of them. They were called ocho derecho, or straight 8, I guess. Each candidate has a short description of their policy specialty, right? They're a little bit like the Avengers. They all have their own superpower, right? One is like the education person. One is for senior citizens. They had all their own sort of superpowers listed at the top. And then at the bottom is a standard calendar. Now, this is a very common giveaway in Philippine politics. I think in U.S. politics it's a little more rare. I think in the U.S. It's real estate agents, right, to give out the calendars, right? So I feel like I have one, like mine is also from a real estate agent. But in the Philippines, if you go into any household in the rural villages, you'll have one calendar from the agriculture or the seed company, right, with all the seeds on what month you plant it. You'll have a calendar with Jesus, from the church. And usually a calendar from your mayor, right? So you'll have 3 of these things. And so what we were hoping was that this would be one of the calendars up on their wall, right? We're not looking to replace the calendar of Jesus, but maybe can we be next to, the calendar of Jesus on it? And so that was the idea with this intervention. And then because we wanted to test the effect of emotional appeals as well, and what happens, can we induce sort of a positive emotion and feeling, as a way to counter the very negative brand of campaigning that Duterte was doing at a time. In some of the treatment villages, we started the activity with like sort of a happiness generating thing where they could personalize their calendar by putting heart stickers on like happy events for their family, right? So it's sort of a very lightweight in terms of, psychological interventions, but for us, just so we could see whether positive emotions can work as well as negative ones, right? And of course, the backstory to that is the party actually wanted to use negative emotional messaging as part of the things, but I told them I wasn't comfortable, in a field experiment where you can't debrief and in a real election. So I told them if they wanted to test emotional messaging for ethical reasons, I was only comfortable doing positive ones, right? But so just remember that, probably everything that we were doing, it probably would have been more effective that way, right? Because they had their own internal polling and internal focus groups about like what messaging works the best. And all of the most effective ones were all negative ones. I think they showed me one where it's like a picture of a dead body, and it was like, this is what happens to you if you don't vote, right? And I was like, okay, we can't do that one. Like I was thinking, I was just imagining, the sort of ethics board headache that would be. So that's why it's this very light touch, not intended to affect actual election outcomes, just enough to be able to measure and understand what's going on, right? So we wanted to be very, very careful with it. What did it look like in terms of the actual study? We start with 195 different villages. We try to match them as much as possible in triplets that are as similar as we can get them. And then within each triplet, we basically flip a coin, right, to assign one to get no door-to-door intervention, one to get the policy, just a standard policy message, and then the other one to get the positive emotions plus the standard messaging. And so what we think this is doing is, the other one gets no information, although keep in mind this is a real election, so it's not really no information, it's just whatever is normally happening in the course of the campaign is what's happening there. The other one gets the door-to-door visit and the calendar. And the other one the last group gets the door-to-door visit, the calendar, but also that sort of additional emotional activity. And so what we find is that, first of all, this direct policy campaigning, even in a context where policy campaigning is not particularly common, it actually changes the way that people voted, right? So we see a 9 percentage point increase in the likelihood of voting for any. And again, this is approval voting, so that's why there's sort of more than one that they could indicate approval for. And we also see an additional number of candidates from the slate that voters are voting for. And in terms of, Anirvan, I'll give you, and in terms of real life effects, just back of the envelope calculations, had we done this intervention in just 10% of the electorate, they would have secured a Senate seat, right? So Ocho Derecho had just placed under the threshold of being able to secure a Senate seat, but just doing this intervention in just 10% of the electorate would have been enough to get them over there. Yeah, Anirvan, please. That's a great question. So because we were partnering with a political party, it was their volunteers who were the ones doing the door-to-door, and we wanted to keep that separate from our research team who was doing the measurement, right? So we didn't want the same enumerators being associated with the party. So we had separate research team for the baseline, endline, and midline surveys, and then the party we trained to do the actual intervention. And for anybody wanting to work with a political party, they're very difficult to work with. I feel like we had to watch them very closely because they wanted to, for example, they wanted to do our intervention in the control group on Nirvan. They're like, oh, if it works, let's go hand out. And I'm like, please don't, please don't. And so it's very difficult to do, but just to keep those lines clear, we made sure that it was separate. That errors what, sorry? Yes. So we actually test specifically for, precisely for that reason. And that's also the reason why we could only do this by village, not by household. Because in the Philippines, you show up to the village and everybody knows that you're there and handing something out, right? So everybody's like, oh, what's happening over here? And so it's like near impossible to do a household level intervention in person. So our randomization was at the village level, and then we tested for spillovers with villages with a lot of social connections. That was our method for doing that. But yes, I think and the other thing is with American politics folks, they always ask, well, what do you do when people say no, they don't want to talk to you? And I was like, why would that, like for me, it was such a weird thing because our problem was the opposite. We're trying to leave the village and somebody would come running out. You missed my house. I didn't get a calendar yet. Or people would tell our team to stay for lunch, and so there was this whole thing where for us, the problem wasn't, people not answering the door. It was like, in all of these treatment villages, more than what households were needed to be treated ended up being treated. So what this means for these results, what we found in this study is that voters can learn. That's the one thing, right? So here, even the most solidly Duterte, aligned voters showed learning. So they learned more about the policies of the other. They did not change their vote, mind you, but they did learn more, and they improved their beliefs about the party. Right? And so the analogy here is like you imagine, a very strong MAGA voter will learn about the, political policies or campaign platforms of another party and improve their view of the other party, right? So this is actually for us a very high hurdle to try to reach. We also find that the sort of face-to-face campaigning works well. That was the other thing where door-to-door campaigning, I think, in the U.S. used to be common. But it's actually not that common. I think other than the Philippines and India, I've not known very many settings in more less established democracies where there have been studies on whether door-to-door campaigning works. We also found that the emotional content, so that extra emotional activity, increases short-term engagement. So we got people willing to volunteer for the party, give their phone number. They're sort of more excited. They had higher levels of engagement at the time of the intervention. But long-term, the information-only messaging was better, and partly because the emotional content was also more polarizing. Right? And so this idea where you can think about emotions being a double-edged sword, right? They can sort of strengthen engagement, but if you don't know how to micro-target, you could also turn people off, right? So that's sort of the flip side. Yes, please. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Comparing those three components, did the emotional content serve as the hook that gets them to look at the informational content? Or was the pure
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, so that's a great question. So we didn't have a pure emotional content. So it was always the emotional content layered onto the information. And one of the things that I was actually wondering was whether either the emotional content would help them learn it better or would crowd it out, or would distract them, right? Like you're excited and happy, you're not paying attention to the policies. We find no evidence for either of those. So it does not help, but does not hurt, right? And so in terms of the sort of policy brief that we did to the party afterwards, like what should we do then? Our message about the emotional treatment is that if your goal is something like party building or institutional building, then emotional treatment is the way to go because it gets people more excited and engaged. You get more phone numbers, right? You get more people volunteering for the party. But if it's more about long-term election outcomes, information only is a little bit safer because it doesn't have that polarizing effect. Right. So that's sort of the trade-off with it. But I was also surprised that there was no interaction between the information and the emotion. Doesn't hinder learning, doesn't help it. And what was nice about this treatment too is that in addition to we always tend to, the vote results are always front and center in the papers. But to me, as a Filipino, in addition to being a researcher, the big ticket item for me was actually the fact that it moderated polarization. You had improved views of what the other party was about, and it reduced this sort of reliance on things like clientelism, social pressure, when people were thinking about the factors that influence their vote. Right? And so for me, this was like the big ticket item, even if the paper highlights the vote choice and vote differences. So that's sort of the context that we're working in. I like to start with that experiment because it also gives you a sense of what Philippine politics is like. But really that first experiment is just step one, right? Like if we know about what type of campaign messaging works when we're thinking about what elites are saying, now how do we know how to get it to stick, right? How do we know how it's interpreted by the communities that are receiving it, right? And here our concern is that, what what are some ways, short of, it's not even so much, like I said, about making sure they're getting the right political information, the right campaign materials and whatnot. But we wanted to explore how communities essentially create this sort of political meaning and political messaging in their amongst themselves, and how they interpret the information that they're getting, right? And this really starts from the perspective that we want to take a relational approach to all of this, right? Where a lot of political information is actually filtered through some form of, you're getting a forward from your friend or your cousin, you're seeing something on your feed that's endorsed by somebody that you follow, right? And so what we wanted to do is explore this relational aspect of polarization. So here, they're showing you some texts from my auntie, my tita. And so she is lovely. She's wonderful. She loves me a lot. She's like definitely looking out for me. She's also my number one source of misinformation and conspiracy theories also. That's the other part about this. And so she had seen me on a TV channel that she does not normally watch, right? So this is like not outside of her political sources. And she saw me on TV, but to her it did not register as political information. Right? So this was and it's not about, like, some people are like, well, maybe she doesn't think you're a very good political scientist. That's not it either, right? Like, she is very proud of me. She thinks, like, just great. Like, she's always like, yes, my niece is an expert on Philippine elections. But even though, she just tuned in for curiosity and whatever, the message still didn't, and it's from somebody she trusts, whose expertise she recognizes. It didn't quite register to her as political information about the elections, right? It's just like, because it wasn't from her normal channels, right? To her, my analysis of the election is the same as, her best friend's boyfriends who knows the driver of one of the politicians said this to her, right? Or, she was standing at the sari-sari store and she overheard, people talking about this issue as the number one issue, right? So all of that is like this equivalent to my PhD and, years of expertise, right? In terms of like how much it weighs, and and it's, like I said, nothing about trust and credibility. She likes me just fine. I mean, she absolutely loves me, right? Like, at the end, she wants to know when I'm coming next, right? But yeah, but that's the idea, right? So this is what we're working with, is what registers to people as political information, right? Is different. Like, how do we address that? How do we think about that? And yeah, I guess I have to do something about my hair at some point. This is the other big ticket item from this.
In the families, there's like a hierarchy of authority. That you're in need. Would you believe people at her level more than you would believe you?
That's a good question. Like, if I were, like, would my cousins have so the tricky part about that is only because I think the younger generation has a more varied source of news and media, so they're also a little more sort of sophisticated consumers of media. I actually don't think, even if I were sort of at the same level, like, if it were my parents, for example, on TV, I think it's the fact that it's not coming to her in her usual sources, right? It's not like her normal political orbit where she gets information from. Now, if I could find, her best friend's boyfriend's friend and then tell him, you know what I mean, and then that filters back to her, then I think it would get through. But yeah, no, it's even happened to me before where she's like, oh, I heard this in my, this in my Facebook group. They were talking about this political assessment. I'm like, yes, Tita, I worked on that. And she's like, oh, so but it's like, it only gets to her through those pathways, right? And so this is the one thing that's both an opportunity but also something that's a bit of a challenge, right? Because if political content comes through these trusted relationships, what if I want somebody to be a little more careful? I'm like, hey, that's a conspiracy theory. That's wrong, that all of a sudden it's not just about the content. You can sometimes feel like you're questioning the relationship, right? And so you're like skepticism and debate and disagreement. So these are all features of, well-functioning democracies, right? I think like it's an essential part of a well-functioning democracy. But in settings like this, it comes with a social cost that I don't think we think about enough, right? Like I could absolutely argue about, just the amount of time I spent explaining vaccines to my aunt, for example, right? But it's like it's difficult every time, right? Because I know she's not even trying to persuade me. She's looking out for me. She loves me. I don't want to, do you want to pick a fight with somebody that is sending you something out of care and out of love, right? Even if it's wildly, something contrary to what you believe, right? And so we wanted to address this part of the disagreement and the debate, right? On some level, I actually thought the information problem is easier than the social one, right? Easier to get people information than it is to like figure out like what social pathway, my aunt will, or understands and responds to. And so what we wanted to do was work at the level of communities, because this is where the information comes from, right? This is where the meaning is made, right? I know it sounds very TED Talkish, but essentially that's how we decide as a community what's important, what information, where we get our information, how we share it, right? And so what we wanted to do was, instead of doing interventions at the level of individuals or parties, we wanted to look at community information workshops, right? And here we did kind of, disguise it a bit as sort of a media training, right, or information type of workshop. But really what we were trying to do is like teach people or to build this sort of community resilience to polarization and misinformation, right? Can we teach ways to slow escalation? Can we teach people how to disagree in these sort of productive ways, which, by the way, I myself cannot do. I've been booted out of more than one family group chat about politics for this precise reason. But we wanted to see whether we can teach people to do better than me in that sense, right? And so here we just have our very relatively simple setup. We have our control villages where there were no workshops, and we just do the survey measures. And in our treatment villages, we have these information workshops. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing there. And then we measure a bunch of different outcomes on like their downstream relationship with each other, information. And what's nice is you've got baseline, midline, and end line. So we have like what it looks like 9 months out, right? Where normally we don't have that kind of long-term effects. So we started our intervention with by rooting it in Filipino culture and values. This was the other thing that's really important to me. It's like, we can think about different ways to do this, but why not look at the easiest entry point, right? Then so here what's nice is that there's widely known, these are actually words for these different values that are articulated about things like unity and social cohesion and togetherness, volunteering. These are all norms that are quite common. And so then we wanted to use that shared set of norms and values as a starting point to encourage people to discuss what does that mean, political information in the context of these things, right? What kinds of political engagement strengthen these norms, right? The ones, which of these norms are important to you? How do you see political information affecting, these norms that are important to you? And essentially, we were trying to shift the conversation from which side is right, like the hardcore Duterte folks versus the ones who hate him, right? To, does this way of engaging strengthen our community or not? Right? So we wanted to can we shift people to thinking about it in a different way? Then, because we're Filipino, we also wanted to add a little bit of fun. So we had these mascots with different types of, rhetorical techniques. Trolling, Trixie, to like teach people what trolling looks like. Chismis is gossip. And then we have like drama diva, when people just like, are acting all dramatic. This is definitely my aunt, this one, yeah. And so we wanted to, after we did these workshops, we saw some changes almost immediately, right? The first, and I have to say surprising, because this was not the intent, it's sort of a downstream thing, but we were not telling people stop using Facebook. We didn't say anything like that in the trainings. But we found less reliance on social media feeds for political information. Now, it wasn't just that they were just not using social media at all. They were still using social media the same amount, just that they were using it for like the dog and cat pictures and then getting their news elsewhere, right? We also saw greater use of traditional news sources. So it wasn't just that they're withdrawing entirely from news, they were switching to things like Rappler, the more like traditional mainstream media outlets for their news. We also saw people reporting that they were discussing politics more. That we were expecting to happen because essentially we're convening all these people and then having these conversations with them. And then one was actually, so this was like one tiny thing. We weren't sure if it was going to work as a measure, but we had a set of questions about, what you think people's intent are. Like if you see, a misinformation post or political post, what do you think, people are doing? And what was really interesting was for the ones where they would see examples of sharing conspiracy theories or misinformation. In our treatment villages, people were more likely to say either that they thought it might be a bot, right? Or that this person might be misinformed, right? Versus normally people are like, oh, they're harmful and you see what I mean? They're dangerous, they're evil, right? And so this sort of idea where you see much more nuanced interpretations of what they think others are doing online just from these trainings. So I was already thrilled with this. I was like, this is already great, If that was the end of the story, as a Filipino, I'd be like, I'll take that, that's enough, I'm happy. But what really made me thrilled was seeing the results on polarization. Right, so here we see, participants were much less likely to agree with the statement that the country's more divided than ever. Right, so even their perception of polarization has changed. Now, I want to add a little bit of a caveat because a part of this might be mechanical in the sense that if you're off of Facebook, you're gonna perceive less polarization because that's where all the contestation is happening. So it might be some actual smaller effects, right? If we're thinking about that. But what's really nice is that sometimes we've seen these in the United States where they try to do these interventions to get people off social media, right, or to change their social media diet. But sometimes it has the backlash or the unintended benefit of making people withdraw entirely, right? And so that was one thing we were very concerned with because it could be that you tell people, online is a bunch of, conspiracy theories and wild things and it's bad polarization stuff. And then they just don't want to have anything to do with politics. But that's not what we see here. We actually see an increase in increase in discussion, increase in political interest. And what's really nice is that even at N-line, we see some of these effects, right? And so in some cases, we actually, like the social media change in, their consumption of social media, you can actually sort of see it, changing as it, between midline and N-line. So that was really nice to see. Now, in terms of downstream political outcomes, the effects were large enough that we actually could see differences in our treatment villages, even in the election that was almost a year away from our intervention. Right? So here we found, for example, candidates who invested heavily in Facebook campaigning. Right now, I'm not saying that all those candidates use misinformation, but usually candidates that campaign that spend a lot of money on hiring, Facebook accounts and people to post on their behalf, usually also spread a lot of misinformation. But we found that those candidates actually had lower vote shares in our villages. Like our villages were more sort of resistant to that type of campaigning. And also one night, so this is not randomized because we could not determine which candidates were going to get targeted with rumors or not, but there were some candidates in our treatment areas that were targeted by online rumors. And these are like completely baseless, right? It is like female candidates being accused of all manner of things. But we found that the drop in support that these candidates received was smaller in our treatment village. So again, I think people were more discerning, right? Like they're looking at this and like, is this a rumor that I believe? Am I gonna respond or react or change my vote? And so we see these sort of parallel downstream electoral effects that kind of show that even though it was, the workshops were almost a year ago, the way that the community as a whole processed information had these long-term effects. Yes, please. Oh no, I'm happy. Like anytime anybody wants to stop for questions, I'm happy to do it.
All right, so in a particular village, how long did the workshop last? Did you have just one or did you have a series?
So we had just one. They're about half a day. Stop for breaks. I feel like if you're Filipino, you got to have snacks in the middle of your workshop. We did want to do more than one, but it was just prohibitively costly to have the teams come back for the second one. To be honest, I think the real, so one thing, I told you that we had different versions of the workshops that we were testing. All of them had identical effects. And I think it's because what really was doing the heavy lifting was getting the community together and talking, right? So but I'd love to see whether, I can have them get together and talk about dogs or something, or, something different, and then see if that is also helpful. But I think having them sort of as a community get together and think about like what norms that community has for sharing information or thinking about information. There was another arm where instead of they had more of like an active, I'm blanking on the English word for it, but like an interactive bit where they could practice disagreement. So like, how do you explain to your auntie that you can't stop COVID with the ginger tea, right? But like I said, all of them were equally effective, so there's no difference across the different ones. So I think like we're follow up for that. We'd like to look a little bit more into what aspects of the treatment we're really doing it. But yes, we did have to limit to something that was a little bit like a little harder to pull apart. Yes, please.
What proportion of the community were involved in the workshop versus didn't attend? What do you think?
Yeah, so actually that's a great question, and I'm going quickly, so I didn't get into it. But it's like less than it was actually a very small part of the community. It's like a dozen or so folks that were involved in the workshops. But what we wanted to do was test how far it spreads. And so what we did in the surveys is we actually we surveyed also the friends and family of the people who participated in the workshops. And what's really interesting is that, because one concern we could have is that we were just teaching them to say the right answer. You know what I mean? Like they go to the workshop, they learn the right things to say, right? But we have the same types of effects even on their friends and family in terms of the social media use, etc., the discussions, the vote, all of those things, and then the vote differences we see at the village level. So even if we did these tiny little, like not very large workshops, it's big, like the effects were measurable at the level of villages, right? So in ways that could not possibly be just those, 12 people, right, in each village. But one thing is also that, actually I don't know what this is in the US, but in the Philippines, voting tends to, the households would tend to all vote the same way. So that would be sort of a one way to already magnify those effects just in, how many family members you have, right? In a Filipino family, I mean, I've got like 24 cousins, right? So if I were doing the survey, they'd have to survey me and then my 24 cousins to see how far these effects spread. But essentially, the spillovers were quite large with these. Yeah, Anirvan, please. I'm sorry?
How were the attendees in the workshop chosen? Were they influential people in the village?
No, I think we could have actually gotten even bigger results if we had done it that way. We just drew them randomly. What was that?
How large is the village?
400 to 500 households, maybe. The problem is in the villages there's a lot of variance. So like there's tiny ones and then huge ones, right? But that's all. But we could also sort of drop down to precinct level effects, which are about the same. Yeah. But yeah, so I think that's like for us one really nice level of thinking about these type of interventions. So now I've told you about two different interventions that we had, like some small effects, but I feel like when you work on Philippine politics, you'll take whatever win you can get, even if it's a small little thing. And so one, the sort of next branch of this research agenda is really influenced by thinking about the new ways, even, like we got an extra way that we're shaping political information environments, and that's like social media and AI, right? Like now it's easier to create fake content, it's easier to do all these kinds, like sort of everything that we were working on as challenges. All of a sudden, there's a whole brand of new ways to address it, right? And what's tricky about AI is that a lot of it influences not just the content creation, but all the algorithmic manipulation influences what we see in the first place, right? And so those are the new areas that we were looking at. We also think about, the tendency is also to think about AI as sort of the bad guy in the story, right? Where, slowly lowering the costs of producing these type of political narratives. I'm just thinking about the AI political videos in the US, right? I mean, they're really, they really spread, like really go viral, right? Like these types of things. And so the idea that they can amplify this sort of emotionally resonant content and increase this sort of idea of echo chambers. And so we wanted to see whether can we use it for good? Can we take something that has been part of the problem or worsening the problem, so to speak, but are there features of AI that can make it part of the solution, right? And so for us, really the main thing is like the fact that you can implement interventions at scale, right, with AI in a way that it's harder to do with the little, workshops we were saying. We could only do one of the workshops. But for that, we were like, okay, well, we have to go beyond just having the AI provide information, right? So there's actually a really nice set of literature in economics where they have a chatbot for misinformation. So that chatbot is very effective. You could sort of use it and test it out, learn some of the things. But we were interested in a different sort of question. And that wasn't, can we get people to be more informed? We wanted to know whether we can we get AI to help people be more reflective? Can we get them to, can we reshape the way that people are interpreting or thinking about things beyond just sort of fact checking them, so to speak, right? And so what we're doing is we're the same type of approach, but just bringing it to the individual level of looking at interpretation and norms and values. The same idea that we had with values at the community level. And so our chatbot, it sounds a little bit like a therapist, but it's sort of what it prompts is, letting people explore uncertainty, helping people consider other points of view or alternative interpretations, but it doesn't actually correct you. So if you say, I just saw RFK and now I don't think vaccines are real, it won't correct you. It'll just sort of, it'll say things like, I'm hearing that RFK is important to you. How does that shape how you see vaccines, right? So things like that. Like it will, if you request information, it will then tell you, vaccines are safe and effective, right? But essentially the goal of it is not so much to be prescriptive or corrective, but to help people reflect and think of a framework for themselves for how to process the information on their own. So I have to admit, we started this just for the purposes of thinking about scaling up our workshop, right? Like that was my only thing. It's like, funding is hard to get nowadays. And so how do I do these type of things for cheaper and at larger scale? But one thing we found in the preliminary results is that AI is actually better in some dimensions than the human facilitators, because for polarization in particular, people don't feel embarrassed to talk to the AI about, like if they have some belief about vaccines that their friends might laugh at them for, right? They're like, they don't mind telling the AI about it. And I remember thinking like, oh, this should have occurred to me, because if I think about all the embarrassing things I ask my AI, I'm like, how do I format this slide? And, like really basic stuff that I think UCSD would like withdraw my PhD if they knew that I had to like look it up. But this idea that it gives us a little bit of space to explore and be uncertain, and so to use it to foster openness was actually more effective, right? Now, the one thing I was concerned is like, well, how will people feel about talking to a robot? I'm like thinking about what will my auntie say, right? If I told her I wanted her to talk to an AI. But that's the other thing, is that almost always people found them to be trustworthy, or they felt fine talking to them, even if you told them this is an AI, these are some of the controversies about AI. people found them to be just as reliable. I think people see them in the same way that they see those, like chatbots in the government and whatever else, where, we're increasingly interacting with in this type of form. So essentially what we did was the biggest challenge for us right now, the point that we're working on, is actually stress testing the guardrails for our AI. My co-author is Nikola Banovich at University of Michigan. He's a computer scientist. And his team developed the new methods for testing guardrails, like to know whether, because that's the thing with AI, we cannot step through the code to see what it's doing. So he has these new methods for how to evaluate whether the AI is doing what we think it's doing, and especially for this type of setting, we wanted to be very, very careful. So that's the stage we're into. Now, what's going to surprise all of you is that the first round of testing that we're doing for this AI, even though it was built for the Philippines to extend the Philippine workshops, first round of testing we're doing is in the United States. And that's because the irony of ironies is because measurement is easier in the US, because polarization is so clearly on party lines. And so our first round of, and I'm sorry to everybody who studies American politics, I feel like when researchers like me think that we can do our studies in your country, I'm very sorry. But that's actually the next round of this work. And so, essentially, just to wrap up, right? I want to close where I began, right? This idea that polarization isn't new. I feel like I actually I don't make a lot of friends in the polarization workshops because I have a very controversial view of this. In that, in the U.S. we tend to think of it as the worst possible outcome, but I was like, if you look at the whole, all the other countries in the world, it's actually somewhere in the middle, right? Like I come from a country where before polarization, we were killing each other. So polarization is a step up, right? So for me, this kind of emotional, identity-based polarization is a step up from that violent conflict. And then if we can get to just ideological polarization, I'm thrilled. I'm like, let's fight over policies, please. To me, that would be amazing, right? So I think like there is a little bit of scale and scope that we need to have a discussion about, I think, when we talk about polarization. But again, this view does not make me very popular amongst the polarization researchers. But like I said, for me, it's not anything new. The only thing new is the fact that it's coming at the same time as this change in political information environments that's making it worse and sort of reinforcing it in a number of ways, right? And here we can't really treat polarization as a failure of information, a failure of reasoning, or even a failure of democratic deliberation, right? It's not about just whether people can classify things as true or false or understand their own political preferences, right? And for me, I think what's important is thinking about how political information essentially travels through relationships, right? These are relational problems at the heart of it. It's not about information, it's about identity, right? It's about I am this type of American and I believe this, or I am this type of Filipino and so I believe this. And so to be able to develop the type of interventions to address that, we also need, our interventions all don't need to be relational in those type of ways. And so what we found is that we can absolutely do that, right? Policy-based campaigning, if you're a politician, you can still do that, even in the most sort of emotionally charged political settings. Community level reflection works not just for bringing people together, changing minds, but for sort of building a broader resilience to things like misinformation and polarization, right? And then even now that information environment is evolving, I feel like nowadays for policy briefings, everybody wants to ask about is AI these days. But while it's bringing its new set of challenges, there's also a lot of opportunities too that we can think about adapting it for. So I think for me, it's not a question of should we intervene or not, or should we try to fix this or not, but it's how, like what are the ways that we can do this, right? Can we design this so that we're encouraging engagement, productive engagement, de-escalation, reducing outrage? Can we support reflection and accountability? And so that's the agenda that I'm working towards. And thank you for the invitation to share my work here with you today.
Great. Thanks so much, Ceci, for just an absolute tour de force. We invite you for one talk and you give us 3 projects. That was awesome.
And call your aunties; they miss you.
Yeah, but they also think you should improve your hair.
That's right.
We have some time for Q&A. Happy to open things up to the audience. If you're online, also, I don't know, Anthony, if we have people live, but the chat should be available if people who are online would like to submit questions. We'll keep an eye there. So does anyone get us started? Yeah, sure. I'll pass the mic back. So I saw Laura first. You Steve and Laura, and pass it forward.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I missed the first part, so if I ask a stupid question, I'll blame it on that because I was teaching. But so I'm wondering, as you were describing the workshops, how much you think of what you're seeing as kind of an example of like the establishment of deliberative norms. And so, for example, if we think about institutions, so I'm a judicial person, so, for example, in the Supreme Court, like when the justices go into conference, there's a series of norms about how they go around and discuss the cases that they've just heard arguments about. So, the Chief Justice goes first, and everybody goes around the table, and everybody speaks once before someone speaks twice. In other spaces about like big, like, collective decision making with like large numbers of people, right? Like we know that like majority rule is not a good mechanism, that like you can have more egalitarian outcomes if you require unanimity rule rather than majority rule. And like that's better for the inclusion. For example, with respect to women, like women's voices become more heard in that kind of context. So I'm wondering if some of like what is being learned is kind of is about like these deliberative norms, because it does seem like it's not necessarily what you're telling them, but it's like the how to do it. So is that kind of how you're thinking about the contribution here, that it's more kind of like you're teaching someone a mechanism?
That's actually I love the way that you put it. I think that's a really elegant way of thinking about it. Because we did think that there might be sort of content differences, right? Like we thought maybe some workshops would outperform the others. But I think actually the judicial analogy is a really nice one, because that's a setting where the views can be very different, but they share a framework for how to come to decisions and how to, so, they like, even if they disagree on what the ruling should be, I feel like there's very rarely things like disagreement on process, right? Like they agree on, here are all these laws and we all agree on these, and this is the process, this is what precedent means, right? So I feel like the disagreements are on the objectives and the goals, and are we doing the right thing to get to the right objective, versus arguing over what does it mean to have precedent and all these type of things. And I think that's a nice analogy, because that's a little bit of what we were trying to do, is move the discussion away from the sort of sense that it's like identity threatening type of disagreements, right, to finding common ground, right? So even if you can't agree on a policy or something else, can we back them up, and can we get them to agree on a value, right? Or can we get them to agree on an objective, right? And then actually, if they can agree on that, they can disagree about what policy tool to get there, right? Like, do we want this to happen? We want our border secure, or we want whatever, and then from there you just start with, okay, well, if we both want border secure, what are the right policy tools? Is this one doing that or not, right? And so I think like that was part of what we were trying to do. And in a way, it's funny because we had to do the training as like a front almost for the type of discussion, and teaching people to discuss and how to express disagreement, right, in ways that are socially acceptable, especially in a setting like the Philippines, where it, even for me and my auntie, right, like it's like sort of, there's a lot of sort of emotional and social baggage that comes with disagreement. And so absolutely, I think almost, there are sort of many frameworks for how to discuss and disagree, right? We weren't forcing people to agree with each other, but can we get them to think about the problems in the same way?
Well, I think that the fact that you're polarizing amongst the polarization theorists, says a little bit about how interesting your work is. And then I have one quick question too. I have to know how much money was in the envelope. And then
Yes.
I have a more serious question about methodology. And if you think that you could do this kind of treatment in the other cases where they don't do as much door to door,
Yes.
so how this would translate into other places where they tend to do like rallies or
Right.
community engagement and things.
Right. Those are excellent questions. Money in envelope is one of my favorite topics. It does vary across municipalities, but within a municipality, it's usually the same rate, right? And then, like I said, probably on average, it's a substantial amount, right? If you think about what's in terms of like an average daily wage. I mean, people can make as much, households can make as much on election day as they can, like, it's like a week's salary maybe on minimum wage. So elections are a big deal. And then in some areas, where the mayor's office is especially valuable for kickback opportunities. Though I've seen places where there was illegal mining in some parts of the country, where the price per vote was like $125 per household. I mean, I feel like I could buy votes here for that if I. Sorry, everybody online. Don't like. I'm not. We're not recommending buying votes, but the amounts are really can really get quite high. And then, sorry, I got distracted. Yes, so that actually was one thing we were looking at doing because that's the one that we thought might be the easiest to scale. Right? So on one hand, actually, the whole intent was to help them design messaging that was more large scale, right? Like something they could put on their advertising and things like that. The only reason why we did it door to door was partly because we wanted to see whether we could break that direct, like people's association with somebody coming to your door with getting an envelope of money, right? It would be one thing. And also for measurement, so we could see more like exactly how people were thinking about it. But I actually think it adapts really well, like that type of messaging. Even in the U.S., where we see politicians, campaigning on policy, right? Even when all of this, everybody's talking about culture wars, and then your governor, I think, is a great example of this, right? I'm looking at Kentucky, and it wasn't that long ago that in econ, we were using Kentucky as almost like in development econ, right? We were talking about maternal mortality, all these things, and now Kentucky is like the darling of the economists, right? In terms of success story, right? For as far as local states go, so I think there's actually it's policy messaging is one of those ones that sort of scale up nicely, in a way that I think actually might be easier to scale up than, say, the sort of deliberative community type of workshops, right? Where you sort of need people to care about each other and have that shared norm already. So in a way, I think that's the goal, right? To sort of scale all of that up if we can.
Can I just get a quick follow up on that? So
Sure.
have you guys done any of these kinds of interventions at the community level in the more kind of like urbanized settings that characterize so much of the Philippines? I mean, I've heard people anecdotally tell me that like the social ties break down, the fabric is just not what it was, and I mean that's part of the story of development.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
so yeah, how do you think about that? This kinds of interventions in settings where the social capital or whatever you might want to call it is just not actually all that strong to begin with.
I think that's where absolutely. So the community workshops, the starting point is the sort of shared, like the first activity is like what norms are valuable to you, to your community, right? So having them articulate it for us and for each other, right? What's important. I do think you need some level of, care for your community, right? Some like interdependence of your preferences and incentives in that sense for it to work. So we did these just outside Manila, maybe like 2 to 3 hours away. So we did have some sort of more urban areas. We saw just, the effects were just as good, in the more urbanish. But, if I were doing this like right in the middle of the city where people don't know their neighbors, I don't think we could get quite the same type of thing. I think you need some, it needs a bit of a community framework to work, because I think that's actually what's doing all the work, is that sort of sense of community, or building that sense of community, rather than, teaching people to argue better, right? Like, I think that wasn't the takeaway from all this.
We have an online question, actually, that I always like to honor those when they come in. So, on the AI front of the project, in terms of sort of shifting from correcting information and beliefs to actually reshaping interpretation and norms, How does AI actually do that? Can you talk a little bit about how that effect would operate? How can AI realistically create that kind of a shift?
So that's a wild thing with AI, right? I said I was always thinking of it as sort of a second best option for me to scale, the workshops, right? To me, I was like, okay, we're just going to make do with this because it's going to be cheaper, easier to roll out. But in a lot of ways, it's actually better, right? And so one is the fact that it's very good at adapting the person. Like my chat GPT thinks I'm just the most brilliant person, like loves all of my ideas, thinks I'm a great teacher, right? And so this thing where this tool is actually meant to be able to elicit a nice interaction with us, right? Like it's precisely designed for that purpose. And so we're actually asking it to do something that's very consistent with what it was designed for. The main tricky thing for us, the main challenge is actually the guardrails, right? How do we make sure that it's staying on? Because, you can have some applications where if it makes a mistake, it's not a big deal, if it tells you the wrong restaurant or something like that. But in a setting like this where it's very polarized and, people can, we can't have it make mistakes, essentially. So that's the biggest challenge that we're having is being able to essentially set it up so that it doesn't go off the rails at all. But in terms of training it to behave in this way, it actually is quite easy in terms of getting it to interact, adapt, right? So if you're talking to it in a certain way, it'll also talk to you that way, right? I feel like maybe that's why I didn't realize, but maybe that's why mine is a little sassy, I'm like, it's like, hey, bestie, listen, yeah, that's what my chat GPT sounds like. But it'll mimic the way that you talk. It'll talk to you about things that it perceives to be important. So that part, I think, is the easy adaptation. The hard part is just, how do we get it to stay on track? And that's like, I think 90% of our effort is in working on that piece of things.
No, it's not.
Hold on, okay. So I'm trying to put this all together. In your training workshops, do you create a trust relationship with the people that they accept your system for interpretation? You're not pushing an agenda, but you're saying, think critically about this. Then how does that feed into their role in working with the AI system? Because the biggest problem is people believe those things uncritically. How do those all work together? Or are they part of the thing as a whole?
That's a great question. So I think it's very much that initially the AI piece was designed as a replacement. We were trying to can we replace these expensive, difficult to run in-person workshops? But the core sort of mechanism is fundamentally different, right? So for the workshops, it's really based in the community, right? Can we create community level norms that then become self-reinforcing, right? As the community continues to engage with each other in that way. For the AI, the idea was a little bit different because there we didn't have a community, right? We have nobody for them to trust and interact with. And so what we're trying to foster there is reflection. Can we get people to sort of reflect and think a little bit more, in a more open-minded way, even on their own, without the help of having the community norms and all of those kind of things. And the way I was thinking about it was actually the analogy for this that I like a lot, and being somebody who loves sports, is a sports one, where if I'm watching my favorite soccer team and they make a call against my team, I'm angry and I'm yelling and I'm yelling at the ref. Are they blind? Now here's the thing: you could point out, hey, Ceci, don't you have a ref certificate? You know exactly that rule was correct, right? Or you could show me a replay. Hey, look, clearly offsides by a mile, right? But the thing is that even if you tell me those things or show me those things, I'm still mad. I'm arguing with you. I'm still yelling at the ref, right? And so the idea is that instead of, the AI essentially acting like it's showing you a replay, telling you what's true or correcting you, what it's doing is it's saying something like, okay, Ceci, as a community of soccer players, how do we want our team to be treated, right? What rules do you think are important? So it sort of has you it sort of de-escalates and steps you back a little bit. So it tries to bring in a little bit of that aspect of values and norms, but it's limited because we don't have the community, right, to sort of support and reinforce.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry. Yes, so no, and actually, maybe you know what? I realized maybe I didn't answer fully the question that came from online, but we essentially create that prompt for. So the AI that we train it to go through a set of stages. So first is like finding some common ground. Next we have them reflect a little bit on where they get information, what things are important to them, and so there's sort of a step-by-step process before we get them to the point where we're trying to get them to be a little bit more open-minded, right? So it'll be like, oh, Ceci, I see that soccer is really important to you, right? So it does sound a little bit like a therapist when you listen to it, but essentially the idea is sort of not to sort of shove somebody into being thinking a little bit more beyond their own view, but just sort of helping guide them so that they get to that point on their own, if that makes sense. So it's a very light touch type of treatment. Much more light touch than some of the ones are corrective, right? It'll tell you you're wrong, this wasn't, vaccines are perfectly safe or whatever else, right? Or that call was clearly offsides, right? But here the idea is sort of to shift the intervention just slightly, right? Away from, right or wrong versus, can you get people to reflect more?
There's an online question that was kind of following up on this, actually.
Yeah, of course, please.
In the AI kind of training process, I guess, like
yes.
you talked in your community intervention about rooting it in local norms and kind of reciprocity and community concern and all that's important to your setting. When it comes to kind of cross-cultural training of AI, like how do you think about that? You said you're working in the U.S. context first, but moving eventually back into the Philippines. Like, how are you thinking about that on the science side?
So that is actually really nice because for that we actually just ask the people to tell us what values and norms are important to them. And so we and that's the nice thing about AI being so adaptive, right? In the workshops, we had to sort of bound it somehow because we had to do training for the people that are facilitating it. But the AI can react to and engage with whatever you want to tell it, right? And so that's one thing where part of the sort of step-by-step thing that we did in training this chatbot is essentially to elicit from people what the values and the norms are, right? And then essentially we're not trying to tell them that their values and norms are wrong, just trying to see if they can be more open-minded. So for example, if somebody says their value is safety in our neighborhoods, right? And so these are all these things, can you see this other issue from that view, right? Or can you see a different policy solution to achieve the value or the objective that you have? So it's very, very, if you think about trying to change things, like ours is like the tiniest little margin, right, of trying to change people's minds, rather than wholesale trying to persuade them, if that makes sense.
So we're coming up on class transition time, but we may have time for one more. If anybody else would like to ask a final question. All right. Well, we are.
How would I? What? Sorry. In Kentucky. I mean, I am a big fan of your governor. I watching the messaging and the communication style. I was like, wow, this is really, yeah. So I mean, like I said, I don't live here, so I don't know if any of it is good or bad. So you all have to let me know. But just in terms of straight up messaging and how a campaign would be run, I am a fan. I think Kentucky is actually would be a great case for this because it's a place where I think the argument about norms and values would resonate, right? And I think it's a place where even if you think about disagreements coming in the how to achieve it part, but I don't think there's a lot of differences in what the values and norms should be part, right? And if we think about dimensions of polarization, I feel like policy polarization, we should all be happy with that, right? If we all disagree on which particular, what's the right tax rate or what's the right whatever, I think that's a lot sort of healthier for U.S. democracy than that. And I actually think a place like Kentucky would be one of the easier places to roll out a method like this because it starts with this idea of values and norms. where I think a message like that would resonate more here than even in Michigan, I think, right, or California, right, where I feel like sometimes it's more about it sort of takes an extra step, right? They almost skip the values and norms part.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ceci, for being here today. If you just small
Thank
signs
you
of
all.
appreciation
Oh, you all are
for
too lovely.
making the trip.
Thank you so much for having me. You were a lovely audience.
Yeah,
Wow,
very
super.
thought-provoking. And for everybody online, again, keep on our social media feeds and eventually the new website to have info about upcoming talks in March. Thanks, everybody.